Hello, everyone. Today I'm with Michael Vannoy Adams, and Michael is a Jungian psychotherapist in New York City. He's a founding member of the Jungian Psychoanalytic Association. He's the author of many books, the last one being For the Love of the Imagination, which we spoke about a little bit last time, Michael. And today we are going to speak about James Hillman. So welcome, Michael. Welcome
Thank you
back.
very much. Pleasure to be here with you.
Michael, when I woke up this morning, I was thinking, one thing about James Hillman is that he has given many images which have gone right into me, that beauty feeds the soul, that the psyche is like a boarding house filled with many different interesting characters. And from myth, I think Hillman, from right at the beginning of reading Hillman, he has evoked a love in myth from myself personally. He said even Hercules had to serve a Lydian queen and spin and weave his female soul. Odysseus had to linger a while with Circe. So he's always speaking in terms of myth, it seems to me. And just before we dive into Hillman, I wanted to just give a very quick recap. That when we spoke before, it seemed to me that you had studied in Freud, you'd studied Freud when you were younger, that you had taken up an analysis or a study of Moby Dick, and that you had applied, some of your understanding of Freud towards that and the symbolism, that you went off to London, and perhaps by this time you were starting to make a move towards Jung, that that in the way you were looking at Moby Dick, and that towards the end of your time in London, I think you met Kathleen Raine, the William Blake scholar, and she mentioned to you that you should go and meet James Hillman. Is that kind of an accurate summary?
That's very accurate. Kathleen said that to me in 1980. I happened to be in London at that time, and as I was leaving her house, she mentioned James Hillman's name to me and said that I should try to meet him when I got back to America. So that was an important moment. I guess your invitation to me to talk about James and my experience of him and my relationship with him.
Yeah.
It's been an interesting experience since we last talked. It's been about 2 weeks, and it's given me an opportunity to think back on all of that. And I discovered a few things. A few things were revealed to me in that process,
right,
that I hadn't expected. I hadn't realized. In the last couple of things we've done, I've introduced the idea of libidinal objects, which you want to call mana objects, and I appreciate your part of the world calling it mana. That's mana is just a synonym for psychic energy, as is libido and is kundalini, and there are all of these chi. Everybody's got his own name for this kind of thing, and
actually, we might call them Turinga objects here.
Well, that's true too. Yes.
On the street, I mean, we might.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, Geza Roheim, the great Hungarian psychoanalyst, he wrote about these things. He was the first person as an anthropologist of Australia. I mean, I don't think he was like some other anthropologist from another part of the world trying to make sense of something elsewhere, and he wasn't always accurate. But he was interested in these kinds of objects and what kind of aura or energy or charisma or there are many words that when one could. I understand that if you've got riz these days. I learned that today. If you have riz, that means you've got charisma.
Right.
And I'm thinking I've got lots of it tonight. As I'm speaking with you, I wanted to show you this libidinal object. Okay,
Yeah.
this is a prized object of mine.
Yes.
It's a lot of love and energy in it for me.
Yes.
It's a votive blue glass votive candle holder that Margot McLean, James's wife, gave me. It was used in his memorial service at the New York Society for Ethical Culture on Central Park West back in May the 4th of 2013,
Right.
about 2 years after he had died.
Yeah.
And so I just thought we would start off with a little memory of James in this way. Margot asked me to write some remarks for the memorial service when she was thinking about what she might do.
Mm.
And this was all very preliminary. I prepared some remarks, and they were not read at the service, but I thought it might be. I found those remarks, and I thought it might be interesting to read them.
Yeah.
I mean, they were written for that specific occasion.
Yeah.
Hillman was the only really original Jungian after Jung. Among all Jungians, he was the most imaginative. As Jung alone pursued what most interested Freud, Hillman alone pursued what most interested Jung, the imagination.
Mm.
Hillman reimagined the psyche as the imagination, and Jungian psychology as an imaginal psychology. To stick to Hillman was to stick to the image.
Mm.
Images, images, and more images. After Hillman, no Jungian can ever not stick to the image. Stick-to-itiveness. Not the ego, not the unconscious, but the imagination. Just imagine Jungian psychology with no Hillman. Unimaginable. So that's what I said after his departure from our presence.
Mm.
If I'm thinking about the first meeting, my first meeting with James, I'm thinking about Jung's first meeting with Freud. Freud was 50 years old, and Jung was 32 years old when they first met in 1907.
Right.
James was 54 years old, and I was 33 years old when we first met in 1980. I was an assistant professor of English and American literature and American studies at Lafayette College in Pennsylvania. I didn't become a Jungian analyst until 2000, 20 years later. In Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung says, Freud was the first man of real importance I had encountered in my experience up to that time. No one else could compare with him. That was not my experience with Hillman. By the time I met James, I had already met a number of important persons who, for reasons that I don't pretend to comprehend, had befriended me.
Mm.
I knew James for 30 years, but differently from the way others who who knew him longer and maybe better.
Mm.
He was not my analyst. He was not my supervisor. He was not my teacher. He was my friend. James had a reputation for not suffering fools gladly, sadly, or madly. He did not exactly endear himself to certain Jungians when he described them as mostly second-rate people with third-rate minds. That was one occasion when James did not say souls, but quite deliberately said minds.
Mm.
Because while eschewing the protection that a hypocritical persona affords the archetypal coward, he was exposing the mental, not to mention the moral mediocrity and anti-intellectual bigotry of a not statistically insignificant percentage of Jungians. To me personally, James was always kind, generous, considerate, funny, and fun. Now, one of the things that I realized in preparing for this little evening or your morning where you live,
Yeah.
this time together, halfway around the world from each other, I thought in my mind I had written 3 pieces about James, specifically about James, 3 essays or articles or chapters. And but when I began to go back over everything, I realized I had written 5. And I have to say, when I think about that, I think that's a remarkable number. And for me, not even to be really aware that I had spent that much writing time writing about James. I'm not even sure that there's another Jungian analyst in the world who's written 5 different pieces on James. I mean, I know Dick Russell's written the biography and all of that. I'm not thinking of comparing myself to anybody in any way. I was surprised to go back in to realize that. If I would go in reverse order with this, the 5th one is one that I presented to the Montreal Jung Society in 2013. That was 2 years after James's death. So that was about the very idea of James and the very ideas of James. It was about James as a thinker. One of the fun evenings I spent with James was at the New York Open Center in Manhattan years ago, and he was giving a talk called Getting in Touch with Your Thinkings. Now, that's kind of like going into the new age holistic learning place where everybody's always talking about getting in touch with your feelings. And James, of course, being James, was going to go in there and talk about the other side of things. Not what you were expecting if you were inviting him. He was going to come into your place and talk about what you were missing. I mean, he was sort of embodied the unconscious to me in that way. So I was writing about how James is a thinker. The 4th time, I mean, the next one was in there. It was in 2006. It was a presentation at the University of Greenwich in London. And that appears as a chapter in my book, For Love of the Imagination. It's called Golden Calf Psychology, James Hillman Alone in Pursuit of the Imagination. That's a little bit about what I was saying about him pursuing what most interested Jung, is that we pursued the imagination. So those were 2. Then a third was presented in London at a conference of the London Convivium for Archetypal Studies. This was in 1997, and I had
just one thing there, Michael. Was that Noel Cobb? Is that something that
yes,
Noel
Cobb and Eva Lowe.
By the way, I just would like to give a little plug because I know some people know about Noel Cobb, but I find his book, Archetypal Imagination, a very beautiful book. It's got some lovely things to say and some good things in relation to archetypal psychology. But sorry, I have interrupted.
No, he was a lovely man. He was very nice to me. He was an American who was an expatriate in England. He had gone over there and stayed. And he also was affiliated in some ways with Kathleen Rain. He was very nice to me, treated me right. Again, we were different people, but I mean, I loved the idea of the word convivium. I thought this was very funny and lovely that he would come up with something called the convivium. And we were at Cumberland Lodge, which is one of these. It's on the royal estate where they have the ancient trees in England, giant trees from Robin Hood's days, and suddenly we were there. Jeanette Paris was there, a number of other people I love, and it was a wonderful time. And I wrote this thing called Refathering Psychoanalysis, Deliteralizing Hillman, and it was about imaginal therapy, individual and cultural. This is when James was talking about soul in the world and taking, it was his version of politics. Archetypal kind of politics or imaginal politics, which is different from, say, Andrew Samuel's interest in politics or some of the others. And so there was that moment. And I was working in East New York, which is the a part of New York in Brooklyn that is one of the most devastated area of if you were looking for all sorts of horrible difficulties in living, then East New York is certainly was at that time one of those places. And I worked at a psychoanalytic psychotherapy agency out there, and I worked with little Black and Hispanic boys or Latinos in a little fathers and sons group. Their fathers were all absent fathers. I mean, maybe one of them had a father who was present, but the rest of them were absent. And so I had this little multicultural reading group that I did with these little boys. It was a little group therapy thing. And so I was out there in the world doing some of the kinds of things James was talking about at that time. But I also really felt that move into sort of extroverted psychology. I mean, James was always saying, well, I'm so sorry that you want to go into training. You still want to go into training. He wanted me to be a Jungian in some other thing, in some other role in the world besides as an analyst. And this was not really for me. I mean, I have a great, I've told people for a long time, I'm not a Jungian analyst who believes in spiritualizing people out of existence. And there are a whole lot of them like that. But I believe I'm connected to the material world and I like it, and I'm glad to be here a little bit longer in it. And I think James is that way too. The second piece.
Just hang on one second, Michael. The
Sure.
politics. So, if you had to sum up the politics of James Hillman in 2 lines, what would you say?
Well, that's a tall order. Well, it had to do with his notions about animism and the soul of the world, or the anima of the world, and his strong feelings about Descartes and the idea that the world is just dead matter. James was not some sort of superficial person with a Gaia hypothesis where he was seeing the goddess in every clod of dirt.
Yeah.
It wasn't like that.
Mm.
But he did feel that the idea that things other than human beings, like at the top of the great chain of being, was this special creation called man in the image of God, that was problematic. And so, I mean, it's funny when he says that the ashtray has a soul. As somebody who was a chain smoker for 40 years, I mean, so there were some times when I thought my ashtray had a soul. I mean, I always laughed about some of these things. If you take them literally, then you get yourself into some sort of serious trouble. I mean, you're back into participation mystique. You're back into what Levi Brule was talking about before people get a clear idea that A is A and B is B and A is not B.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm glad for Aristotle and that kind of logic and all of that, and I'm not looking to. I mean, if I say I'm um, I don't know what sports team would if I'm a Baltimore Oriole baseball fan, I don't literally imagine that I've turned into an Oriole, but
Well, Orioles are biscuits here, Michael. So I've just kind of lost the thread, but
yeah.
I do.
Well, the last time I talked to you, I made this completely ridiculous assertion that an armadillo is a marsupial, and somehow was confusing armadillos with possums. I grew up with both of them, but armadillos don't have pouches, so I just want to go on record being embarrassed as a Texan, getting my species mixed up here. So at the Festival of Archetypal Psychology in honor of James Hillman, deliberately a festival and not a conference, at
Yeah.
Notre Dame University in Indiana in 1992, I gave a talk there called My Imaginal Hillman, or James, I'll See You in My Dreams. And it was a commentary on a few of some 20 or 30 dreams of mine in which James had figured prominently as an image. And so it was a very interesting little moment. Afterwards, Robert Bosnack came up to me and said, he came to my session and listened to that. And he said the main thing that struck him was that my dreams of James were a whole lot nicer than his dreams of James. So I don't know what came to Robbie, what kind of James came to him in his dreams, but my dream,
But it
James,
is a lot, isn't it? That's a lot of dreams to have
that's a
about
lot of,
someone.
yes, yes. And to me, they were all very interesting to contemplate.
Mm,
I had a lot more dreams of James than I ever had of Carl Jung
mm,
or Freud.
mm.
Um, and then there was a woman, Jackie Schechner, who was an analyst from Boston, who was at that conference, who she came up to me afterwards and told me a dream she had had of James, in which he was a kind of solar hero, a kind of radiant, a white hot, red hot, blue hot, radiant solar hero, like a kind of sun king. And she interpreted that dream of hers as, if you can't stand the heat, get away from James Hillman.
Yeah.
Like that he was a hot commodity. I mean, he was he had the libido. He was burning with libido
Mm,
in a radiant way.
mm.
And, he was not for everybody.
No.
And a lot of people couldn't stand James.
Yeah.
Uh, but I saw no reason myself personally ever to have that kind of feeling about James. I could see other people doing that, and I could sort of understand why they said what they said, but um, that was not my experience at all. And then
One thing, Michael, is that from my point of view, is that if someone has strong ideas and strong thinking, to me, if it comes from the ego, that's one thing. But with James Hillman, I would say that's in service of the soul. You can see his commitment, his loyalty to the psyche or the soul all along the way, and the depth dimension of it. And so his mind, his wonderful power of thinking, it's it's not an ego thing. Whereas I think that's where I personally feel some people mistake him. But whatever. I know that James Hillman's not for everyone, so they're more than entitled to that view.
Well, let me just do this last little one, and then we'll go on to ego, soul, and all of that in just a second.
Yeah.
I realized that the first article I wrote was back in 1985. And that's when I was that year, 1984, 85, I was in India.
Hmm.
And this was published in an Indian Journal of Literary Criticism in 1985. And it was called Deconstructive Philosophy and Imaginal Psychology, Comparative Perspectives on Jacques Derrida and James Hillman.
Right.
I was the first Jungian analyst to write anything about Derrida and Jungian analysis.
Right.
And I thought I saw some of the things that James was doing were, bore some kind of comparison to the kinds of things that that Derrida was doing at that time. So those were the 5 things that I have written specifically about James, to my surprise. And all of that has led me to emphasize, as we're talking here, that this is my James again. This is my image of Hillman.
Yeah.
This is my subject level interpretation of James. It's not to be confused with James the object or James as he was to other people. This is just my version of this particular person.
Yeah.
There were a number of things that I liked a lot about James, and then there were some things that I was not so keen on. And I'm assuming this is the same for any sane person dealing with Freud, Jung, Hillman, or anybody they know and love. They have some things that James and some of these people made it possible for me to live something that's very natural to me, which is to have a kind of a take it or leave it attitude toward these things, where I felt free to take what was useful to me or valuable to me or important to me and I didn't have to kind of be a card-carrying member of somebody's party or to
Yeah.
give a loyalty oath.
Mm.
I don't like these ideas of cults or hero worship or anything like that.
Mm.
Uh, Freud, Jung, James, nobody has occupied that kind of position for me.
Mm.
I just am allergic to it. It's
Mm.
anathema to me.
Mm.
And so this is just Mike Adams's notions about James Hillman for what it's worth this evening.
Mm.
Now, one of the things that was so important to me was stick to the image.
Mm.
Um, if you go read The Dream in the Underworld, which was it's my favorite book by James. It's a book that I taught for 30 years at the New School or the New School for Social Research in my dream interpretation course. It's the only book of his that I taught, and I taught it for a very, very long time. And so in The Dream and the Underworld, it's not like he's not saying in that moment that this is something he came up with. In fact, he attributes it to Rafael Lopez Pedraza, at that time his friend and companion, when they left Zurich and they went over to London and to the Warburg Institute, and they hung around there and they invented something that got to be called archetypal psychology. And in The Dream and the Underworld, Hillman says he recommends, and I quote, a method that Lopez Pedraza felicitously calls sticking to the image. Now, you see, James is not taking credit. He's not saying, I've come up with this bright idea of sticking to the image. At that point, he's saying, my friend Lopez Pedraza in Zurich, this is his thing. This is the stick with which he keeps on beating us over there. Stick to the image. Let's not do this symbolism stuff that's so popular in Zurich. Let's not do concepts or symbols. Let's stick to the image. Uh, but when you go back in there and you see how it was neither Lopez Pedraza nor Hillman who originally proposed the technique, it was Jung. In The Practical Use of Dream Analysis, a lecture he gave in 1931, Jung says, to understand the dream's meaning, I must stick as close as possible to the dream images. And in a seminar he conducted in 1936, 1940 on children's dreams, he articulated an even more imperative version. We have to keep it very simple and stick to the image. So in this instance, the distinctive, and I would emphasize valuable contribution of Hillman was not to originate a method, but to promote the technique as a dictum that Jungians could employ as an impactive slogan. The maxim of the Jungians to stick to the image is the radically definitive ultimate rejection or refutation of the basic rule of Freudians to free associate to the image. The Jungians after Hillman and after Pedraza and after Jung, their technique is to stick to the image, and the Freudians still associate to the image. Or as Jung said at one point, this is to dissociate. That free association is dissociation. So sticking to the image is a whole new thing. It's one of the things that's most important to me about James is that he emphasized this in a way that nobody could ever forget. Okay, so that's an enormous contribution. Yeah. Another one is his thing about individuation. He was different. Individuation for James was not about becoming whole. It was not about integration of the personality by the end of your life. It was about differentiation. It wasn't about you getting unified or having a reunion with yourself. It was about multiplicity and about difference. It was about differentiation. Joseph Campbell said, follow your bliss. And James, and we've had 100 years of psychotherapy, he says, follow your fetish. I mean, those are similar kinds of things, right? And then
I could easily imagine him saying, follow your peculiarity as well.
Well, he does. In Interviews, which is one of my favorite Hillman books, he says that individuation seems to me to be a necessary fantasy to carry one's hopes so that one can live one's oddity. Now, this is a very different definition. I mean, let's put it this way. James is again emphasizing one definition of individuation that Jung gives. Jung gives two. One is the integration thing about wholeness, which makes James and me very uneasy.
Yeah.
Okay. And then the other one is about difference, which is also what Derrida is doing. He's with this idea of difference. Like we're not doing binary things anymore. We're not doing oppositional logic. We're doing differential logic. We are embracing our differences as we go forward. Now, that seems to me to be post-structuralist, postmodern, and a breath of fresh air in the Jungian world. But most conventional Jungians are still into defining individuation as becoming a whole, your whole self. And James was very different in that way. Another thing I liked about James was he was
because it can become a dogma maybe, and I think he suffered at the hands of it reading Dick Morris's book. That kind of dogma while he was in Zurich, he lived through a bit of the suffering of that.
You mean Dick Russell? Is that what you're talking about?
No, James Hillman lived through the suffering of the Jungian dogma about becoming whole and fully integrated and this and that, because he's an unusual thinker. I'm just trying to put it in my words.
Oh, well, you mean personally? Thing. Oh, yes, of course. Of course, they criticize him for being one-sided or being partial, and in the second volume of Dick Russell's biography, he gets into some of this. Is that he suffered personally from some of these things. These are things that I mean, one either capitulates to this sort of thing and gives into it and becomes a coward, or is decorous, or has good manners, or at some point you face yourself and you speak up. And sometimes you have a sharp tongue about it. And I have to say that there are a whole lot of people in the Jungian world who want everybody to pipe down. James was not some sort of loose cannon.
No.
He thought about these things. Maybe he said some things sometimes that he regretted, but I think he was pretty. He was considering he wasn't watching his words, because the basic problem with psychoanalysis is what you should not censor yourself or cancel yourself or silence yourself. You should find some way to speak your truth, whatever it may be, to the world, and then let the chips fall where they may.
And I remember him saying once that when this has stayed with me as well, when psychology began, there was the living speech, the uncouth speech, in those, the soul was speaking in an uncouth manner in those asylums or whatever. So it's kind of like it's all become so sanitized in the way that we sometimes like to speak, that it loses a bit of its oomph.
Now, you know what's going to happen here, right? We have about 15 minutes left, and so we're going to have to do another part 2 on this thing, because we're not going to get anywhere near this thing. I'm just going to quickly mention 2 other items, a metaphorical versus literal. James even can say something very extreme like all is metaphor. I mean, that's a quote. He doesn't really mean that, but he's making an exaggerated statement in order to make an impact of some kind there. His whole thing about multiplicity versus unity, the many versus the one, or polytheistic psychology versus monotheistic psychology. And then number 5 on my list of things I liked about James, and there were other things too, of course, but I've just picked these 5 for this moment, is the idea of an imaginal ego. In The Dream and the Underworld, he says of the ego that it too is an image. Now, this is a real exception to the rule that Hillman isn't truly original. The observation that the ego is also an image, like all the other images in the psyche, like it's not an exception. It doesn't have some different ontological status. It too is an image. It's your own self-image is your ego. It's not some objective Archimedean point. Would never have occurred to me on my own. I owe that observation to James. To my knowledge, Jung never imagined the ego that way. And it's persuaded me to adopt the term ego image. And I've had a little tussle with Wolfgang Gigerich over whether it should be the image ego or the ego image. I find um, I find this personally amusing.
Mm.
So anyway, those are the 5 things I liked. Now let's go on to the thing that you brought up here, which is um, the soul in a way. But right before that, I want to tell a little story about something that I want to tell an anecdote of when I was teaching at the New School. I was teaching undergraduates, and I was teaching my dream interpretation course, and for these undergraduates, 14 weeks of 2 classes a week for an hour and a half or an hour and 45 minutes. It was a much bigger, important, a more rigorous dream interpretation course than you get in any of these Jungian training programs. I mean, it was real university course in it. I doubt that there was a course like it in all of America, really, because the psychology departments, just Jung is persona non grata. I mean, he's not even on their radar. It's
Yeah.
not that they have some animosity against him. He's just irrelevant as far as they're concerned. But the New School was a little bit of an odd place where one could, at least at that time, you could do some strange things, and I could design my own course. I mean, I was not a full-time faculty member, and so I had a lot of leeway at this particular college at that time. So I taught this dream interpretation course. One afternoon, an undergraduate student, a young man who later worked for the radical revisionist American historian Howard Zinn, I don't know whether you know him,
Yeah.
appeared for my office hours. He proceeded to tell me how grateful he was to me for assigning The Dream in the Underworld as required reading. He told me that in the last year, he and his girlfriend had been so depressed that they had both been seriously considering suicide. He didn't know that the title of the second book that Hillman had written was Suicide in the Soul. He told me that Hillman's discussion of what I like to call the D words of the underworld, for example, dream, descent, down, deep, dark, depression, and death, had depathologized and depotentiated his and his girlfriend's existential extremists and enabled them both to abide. He believed that the dream in the underworld had saved his and his girlfriend's lives, at least for the nonce. Now, that's a pretty powerful thing. I never told James that. I mean, I don't know that I've ever told anybody that story before. But, it would be a wonderful thing, I think, if somebody had written a book and he hears something like that it's made that kind of difference in somebody's life.
Absolutely.
It made this sort of thing not so abnormal, right? That you could get low and you wouldn't have to take a drug and get high, or I don't know, get stimulated in some way, or go party, or I don't know what. You could just stay with that. And so this gets us into the soul thing. If I would say Jung in volume 7, he's got relations between the ego and the unconscious. So his axis is the ego unconscious axis. Edward Edinger comes along and he does the ego self axis, which sends James and me up the wall because we don't like that word self. And then Hillman comes along, and if I may say so, I believe he comes up with the soul imagination axis. I mean, I'm saying that with a grin on my face. I mean, I think it's kind of hilarious. The word soul has a different and perhaps richer valence than other words such as spirit, mind, and brain. Everything now is, we don't have psychology anymore. We have neurology, or worse, neuroscience. It's what Jung called brain mythology, and it's also what Freud said was the biggest disastrous mistake he did with his project for a scientific psychology, was to talk about the brain instead of the psyche. You got to remember that when James was born, he was born in 1926.
Right.
That was 1 year before Babe Ruth hit 60 home runs. James was a big baseball fan. He always was using baseball metaphors. At the Open Center, when he gave that talk on getting in touch with your thinking. There was a guy in the audience who stood up and asked James a question, and James says, "I don't think I want to answer that. I don't want to talk about it." The guy got enraged, demanded his money back. There was quite a scene, and James said, "Look, you don't have to swing at every pitch." You see, now there's, I don't know, you may play cricket and we play baseball or whatever, but you don't have to swing at every pitch. And James would say these kind of little things, they're quite quotable. They're memorable. This is what you were talking about at the very beginning of the evening. He had a gift for these things. They're quoting him.
They're entertaining as well as deep, if you can put it that way.
They're quoting him. They're not quoting me. Maybe after tonight, I'll be quoted all over the place.
I hope so.
Yeah. Well, this was 1 year before Babe Ruth hit 60 home runs. He was born. It was 3 years before the Wall Street stock market crash, which prompted the Great Depression. And, he was in Atlantic City, and his father had a hotel there, and that hotel was a victim of the Great Depression. It went under. So there were consequences. But in 1930, one of those great classics of the American songbook came on the scene, Body and Soul. That song, Body and Soul. So James grew up in a time, if you want to think about those two very important concepts, not spirit, not mind, not brain, but body and soul. Like the 20s and the 30s, I mean, people were, I don't know,
talking in that language.
Well, they were becoming more erotic in America. They were becoming more romantic. And I'm saying that in some ways, James is a child of a kind of romantic moment in modern America.
I would also say, it goes back to the Neoplatonism and the way they spoke about things too, doesn't it? Like it goes back to that old tradition of speaking about the soul.
Mm-hmm. Now you want me to have my diatribe against the soul? See?
You're going to have a diatribe against the soul?
I'm going now attack the soul, okay?
Okay, you're going to do a Hillman on me.
Hillman was not the only person to promote the word soul in psychoanalysis. Bruno Bettelheim criticized James Strachey, the translator of Freud, for translating the German word Seele as the English word psyche, rather than the English word soul, the literal and obvious synonym. Okay, so there was already simultaneously with James criticizing the not including the word soul in there, Bettelheim in the Freudian camp was also from his angle saying that soul is a much more resonant word than psyche or ego or mind, and that he was criticizing the British and the English. There's the mythological side of the English, which is Kathleen Raine, and then there's Newton, Locke, and those guys with British common sense philosophy, and those guys are always trying. It's the puritanical tradition in England versus the mythological tradition. John Milton, Blake, and Shakespeare, and all of those people are on one side, and then you've got these other people who are being they're kind of ascetic. I mean, they're kind of rigid, and they do want to purify things. I mean, they don't like the excesses of the Catholics and all this. That's why they have Guy Fawkes Day. They want to burn them at the stake still, because I mean, there is a discussion to be had there. There's not an obvious these people are right and these people are wrong. There's a conversation to be had there among the parties. But the idea of soul, for me, it's a bit problematic because of the traditional historical religious connotation. And my being an atheist, this is not exactly my cup of tea. And then back in 1995, there was an article in the New York Times about James called "How the Soul is Sold."
I remember seeing that one.
Suddenly, soul got commodified and monetized, and this was another reason that I didn't like it, and I was suspicious of it. Thomas More came along, defrocked Catholic, teaching at Southern Methodist University from my neck of the woods down there in Dallas, near where George and Laura Bush live and all that, the SMU Mustangs. my grandpa was on their football team back in early 1900s. I always thought I was going to go to college at SMU. Okay, but Thomas didn't get tenure there, and he met James when James was down at the University of Dallas, and they got to be good friends. And then Thomas popularized James's ideas
He
with his
did.
book Care of the Soul and Soulmates.
Yeah.
And this was like these were trade book bestsellers on the New York Times. They made some money. It's like Clarissa Pinkola Estes
Yeah.
and Women Running with the Wolves. It was
Yeah.
like Iron John for Bly. There were Robbie Bosnack with A Little Course in Dreams.
Such a shocking thing for the intellectuals of the world that they went out and made money and
Well, yes, and
popularized.
yes, and as Andrew Samuel said to me, the kind of books he said, Mike, the kind of books that you and I write lose money, and no truer words were spoken.
But
But
can
I'll
I
tell
just
you,
say I know that you're saying things, Michael, and I like all of the things you're saying. But in defence of the soul, I would like to say, as a layperson, that what you often see is people coming into the Jung world, and then all of a sudden there's this ego self-access, this and that, and it's like this technical jargon, which one thing I take from Hillman is the aesthetic response. And there's something about when you talk about the soul, or when you use that language, you can start to talk about your aesthetic responses in the world without getting into the conceptual jargon and losing, too much. And it's not a game of how much we know. And that's what sometimes turns me off the Jung. So I like it when Thomas More speaks about the soul. Mm-hmm. But anyway, we can 94% agree.
As Jung says, as Jung says in those postcards that I own, it's not at all surprising that people have disagreements. In fact, it's perfectly natural. Yeah. And it would be hideous if there was one group mind like the Borg on Star Trek, where you just, everybody thinks the same. That would be the strangest possible condition that you could ever inhabit. And so let's see. I'm going to go and do a little odd thing now for the next minute or two, and go back to that a quotation that James talks about having the status of "let there be light." He says, Freud's statement, "where id was, there ego shall be," is like "let there be light." It's very it's as if the booming voice of the deity is uttering this thing, this proclamation, this fiat, right? So that in the metaphor that follows that, when he says "where id was, there ego shall be," he's talking about the Zeider Z. He's talking about the little Dutch boy with the finger in the dike. He's talking about what Freud calls the land reclamation project. It's totally anti-ecological. If you wanted a colonialist, imperialist, wreck the environment kind of idea of what the psyche is about, then you just quote Freud on this. It's to push back the ocean. In fact, the ideal thing would be to end up with David Bowie, the man who fell to earth. Instead of that, you'd still be back on that planet where there is no water now, and everybody is wearing some space outfit that recirculates their own urine. Right. Okay, and it's you're no longer living on a wet planet. It's not the blue planet anymore. It's now the red planet. Okay, I don't know why Elon Musk and Grimes want to go and spend their last years on Mars. I want to be here where it's wet. And James he wrote an essay on the moist, an alchemical essay on moisture. The words like ego are very dry. Mind is very dry. They have a dry connotation.
Yeah.
And soul has a wetter, and even it has a little bit of a body connotation.
Yeah.
And so James contrasts spirit. He doesn't contrast ego with soul so much as he does spirit with soul. So soul has a lot to recommend itself in that way, and it's very valuable for some people. And he also was very happy that African Americans had brought soul with soul food and soul music and all that sort of soul thing back into the
He,
culture in
he
a
was
way.
kind of a James Brown man, although I've never heard him say that. But yeah,
Well, the Godfather of Soul, I mean, that was not James, but um, I mean, there were
yeah,
two Jameses there, right?
yeah,
I mean, um, and so um, the nomenclature here is a big kind of question. How you would speak about this and for what sort of purpose?
mm,
For Freud, you see, the I or the ego. I mean, why even go from Bettelheim was saying, why don't you just say I? Why do you have to come in with this Latin word ego? That was another criticism of his. Like, what's that about? Strachey. And, that's a questionable move as well. Now, I actually like the word ego, and maybe it's because I had a Latin class when I was in high school in Texas. I don't know. They don't offer those things anymore in public schools.
mm,
But I was burdened by Heek, Hike, Hoke, Amo, Amas, Amat, and these kinds of things
mm,
in that class. So I don't have a real problem with ego, but I have a problem with ego psychology, and I have a problem with Freud being a child of the Enlightenment, coming out of a shtetl in Moravia and moving to the big city of Vienna and looking toward Paris and wanting to define the ego as reason, because the reigning god, as Jung said, is the goddess reason. In Notre Dame Cathedral, they literally put the goddess reason. What a blasphemous act that was! Not into the patriarchy. Those
mm,
people in the Age of Reason and the Enlightenment in Paris
mm,
installed reason in there as an
mm,
archetype
yeah,
where faith had been before.
yeah,
Correct. And so if you're defined, like it's like the ego is in there instead of soul, and the ego defined as reason is in there as the soul defined as faith. That's a huge move.
mm,
Now, in some ways, I'm immensely grateful for that. I find it liberating in some ways. I'm glad these people came along and introduced us to reason,
yeah,
because I have seen personally what it's like actually like to be in a place where people are living with a whole different worldview.
mm.
And it's almost like being in the Middle Ages if you've been to some places on the planet. Yeah.
You're talking about Texas now?
Well, we call it God's country. We don't call it the Holy Land down there. But I was talking about my wife and India and the incredible multiplicity and complexity and variety and richness of India with its 13 different languages, 300 and something dialects, and multiple religions from Jainism to Sikhism to Hinduism to Islam to
Yeah,
you name it,
yeah,
and with multiple gurus and everything else. I mean, you can find anything and everything there. But on the other hand, you can also witness things directly that you're not. I mean, I'm up here on the Upper West Side where the people are wearing yarmulkes and they're taking their children to synagogue, and they're very serious, and you've got the ultra orthodox, and you've got the reform, and you've got all these things, and you've got people up here who are mainly socialists or sort of left liberals, and that's a whole other kind of sensibility.
mm,
And so these different ethnic groups and these different nationalities and these different regions, these are incredibly rich and diverse traditions.
mm,
And for me, um, I don't situate myself as having allegiance to only one of these things. I mean, I'm very aware of what I grew up in and how I came out of that and where I am at this point. And I'm not running around trying to convert everybody to atheism.
mm,
I'm not into that.
mm,
And But if we're talking about the soul, And
I would just like to say also, Michael, though, that there's another thing with Hillman. Is that okay? I resonate with that languaging, right? But one can speak about the psyche with Hillman too, and I think the way he reminded that, psychology was named after psyche from myth. So that gives, you know what I mean? It's like probably a lot of these things depend on how people resonate with it. But that is another term which doesn't have the religious connotation. But it still gives the same kind of feelings,
well,
ideas to me.
it's against the idea that everything is going to be abstract now. I guess one of the great contributions of James is to talk about what I have advocated as a psychoanalysis of particularity. He likes to be specific and not abstract. And this is like the minute particulars of William Blake again too. There's a whole tradition here of looking at very particular things with great precision, and instead of these giant abstractions that some people find attractive.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not trying to eliminate the tendency toward abstraction. I'm just saying my heart and my soul and my psyche and my ego, all of those things, they tend over in this other direction.
Yeah.
And so James, to go back to end this first session on this, but to go back to where you started, we're talking about psychology and mythology.
Yeah.
And James saying that ancient psychology the mythology of the ancients was their psychology.
Yeah.
And modern psychology our psychology is modern mythology, is our modern mythology.
Yeah.
James liked to do these little funny flips. He liked to flip-flop these things, and that one is a nice one.
Yeah.
But when you're talking about psyche, and James reminding us that this is not just a term or a concept, correct? He's saying we need to remember that this actually is the name of a goddess.
And for me, that in the Myth of Analysis, which is my favorite book of his, Eros and Psyche it kind of strikes me as one of Hillman's main myths. That's how I get it, and that they need each other. And there's so much Eros in Hillman, and there's so much Psyche. But the two are in interaction.
Well, as he says, the product of Eros and Psyche coming together is pleasure. Their child is pleasure. Yeah. And that's how I end that essay on For Love of the Imagination, because it's the pleasure principle or the love principle or the lust principle or the eros. It's like my other great friend Marcel Duchamp saying eros c'est la vie. It's like it's life.
Yeah.
The erotic dimension that makes the world go around. And so and Susan Sontag, who writes her famous essay against interpretation, there says, I don't want a hermeneutics, or at least the kind of interpretation that Freud is doing. I don't want that kind of interpretation. I want an erotics instead of a hermeneutics.
And we don't want more ideology in my world, but we want more erotics.
Well, that would be another way of putting it. And another example of this is James's writings on narcissism, because in that he reminds these people who are doing the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM, whatever it is now.
Yeah.
That sort of thing where everybody diagnoses people for insurance purposes. Yeah. James is reminding you that the little box there that enumerates the criteria by which you would diagnose somebody with narcissistic personality disorder, that is abstract and dry and poor in comparison with the actual myth of Narcissus.
Yes.
And
the transformative quality of that myth.
Yes. And so story myth. I mean, as Joseph Campbell says, a myth is from the word muth or mouth, and it's an oral tradition where it's spoken word. You tell the story, and these psychiatrists and other people who do the DSM,
And
they don't.
as if we don't all get narcissistic sometimes. Like I get a brittle ego when my football side loses, Michael. I don't know about you, but a hard and brittle ego, meaning it's in all of the abstraction and just the whacking that down as a fixed idea, as if we
Well,
don't
James
go
says
through
it's not.
periods.
James said the myth doesn't say it's love of yourself; it says it's love of an image. And so he immediately takes it to the image that Narcissus sees, the reflection he sees in the water, and there's so many other parts of the DSM with its little 4 or 5 one-liners omits so much of the detail and richness and the story of the actual myth. And so James, so you can also say that that has something to do with beauty and aesthetics, and it's not ugly. The other thing gets a little ugly, and it gets
Yeah.
you're telling people they have a disorder. It's not that they just have a certain style, like you're kind of like into love of images, like Narcissus, and we could talk about that. You're
Yeah.
already dividing them up and negating them.
Yeah.
You're saying that somehow you're wrong here. This is bad.
It's not healthy.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
that's another thing.
I mean, Michael, can I suggest, like, I've enjoyed so much what you've said, and it's always a pleasure to speak to you. And maybe that is a good place to leave, and we can, because I know we're starting to run over, and we can take up some of these.
I think we ought to do a second session on this. It'll be Hillman Part 2, and then we'll get into some personal anecdotes, some
Yeah.
real experiences I
I,
had with James by
I
myself, alone with him,
I'd
how he
love to get
treated
into that.
me, all of those kinds of things. It
And
might be
I don't know whether we got to it today. Maybe we did, but you were saying right at the beginning that as you were thinking about this, some things were revealed to you, like you thought of some things in particular. So did we reach all of those as well? I mean, maybe that's the thing for next time as well.
Well, I'm not sure about that. I'd have to kind of give that a little bit of thought and reflect on what we did this evening, and look at my notes. And so anyway, this has been a lot of fun.
Yeah.
I hope it's valuable to people. I hope they get
Very,
something out of
very
that.
valuable to me, and I hope it's valuable to other people as
I
well.
think I'm feeling more comfortable in this format. I mean, as you know, I'd never done a podcast before that first one I did with you, and I've got myself another camera now, and I'm getting myself set up more properly, and I'm feeling a little bit
More comfortable.
more at home with this. And you go your personality and your feeling, your aesthetics. They're very easy in that way, and I'm grateful to you for that.
And likewise.
So until next time.
Thank you, Michael.